Hey everyone, today I want to take a look at creating a task system with you. It's not quite so straightforward as you'd think, but it's also not super hard, so we're gonna just jump in here. There's gonna be a second part where we take a look at more in-depth, more custom tasks that require more replication work to be done. But for now, let's stay with the easy part. And I'm just gonna show you what we'll end up making here. Oh, and while this is loading, let me just tell you that you should definitely go check out AR Night Ops on GitHub. There's a lot of task stuff here as well, and even some more stuff like showing a thing in the UI, or like a waypoint in the UI where you have to go for your task. So check that out. And also I will leave my notes public, so you can go read through basically what this tutorial is in text form. I'm gonna update this before I upload this video. Okay, so we're in the world editor, right? We're just spawned here, and we can press J to bring up our tasks. And you can see we have this task called move here, please. We can even show it on the map. It's very close to the spawn point. You can see there it is, and we can click on it to assign or unassign ourselves. And we even get a little pop-up here saying the task move here was assigned to you, or unassigned, or completed, etc. This is a second player that's going to join the game any second now. So there we are. We just joined the game, and don't worry about that. That's just my hard drive being too slow. But we can press J here as well, and we can see the objective. And it says assigned players is this other player, and I can accept, and then we have 2 assigned players. And if we go back here, we can also see that it's there. And let me just walk into this trigger. We should see, aha, completed. And if we go on the other player, it's also been completed and it's gone from the list. And if I walk over here, it shouldn't complete again. So there we are. Alright, so what do we actually need to make this? I'm gonna just close out of the world editor, and we're just gonna create a new world. So I'm gonna open up the scenario base again, and we'll create a new world so we can do everything from the start. Alright, so we're in our scenario base, which has all the necessary managers set up for us. And I'm just gonna create a new subscene. Okay, so our subscene is created, and the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna set up a really basic game mode. I'm just gonna set up game mode plain. Which is basically, it's just gonna respawn us without the respawn menu, etc. It's just the most basic thing you can have. I'm gonna also find the faction manager, because we need that. And I'm just gonna use faction US versus USSR, and I'm gonna drag it into the game mode so it's a child of it. I don't think that's necessary, but it's just very neatly organized. And I'm gonna do the same for loadout manager, which is also necessary to exist. After that, first off we can save, and I'm gonna call this tutorial task world. And we're gonna come over to the base game mode, to the automatic respawn handler component, and we're gonna force faction to US. Obviously you don't have to do this, but if you only place down, say, a US spawn point and not a USSR spawn point, sometimes it will try to spawn you as USSR, but won't find a spawn point, and then you'll end up in the middle of the ocean. But if you force it to US, then it's always just gonna pick the US. Speaking of which, we're gonna grab a spawn point US. Gonna drag that in here. It can be separate, doesn't need to be in the game mode. And there we are. So this is our very basic game mode setup, nothing special yet. Now, we want to set up the tasks and task manager now. But that isn't actually quite as easy as you'd think. Now there are already pre-made tasks here, and we can use those. If you just search for task, you'll find stuff like a trigger task, which is really useful. Let me just drag this in here. What it does, it creates a task, which you can give a name and description and stuff. And it's also going to create a trigger entity below this trigger task. And you can customize this trigger to whatever you like. As soon as onActivate is called, it's going to finish this trigger task. Unless you click to fail, then it's going to fail the trigger task. You can also use onTrigger deactivate instead of trigger activate. You could say onDeactivate fail, and then you could say if the player leaves an area, you can fail the task. And yeah, so just you can play around with these pre-made tasks. They are fine to use. You can use them. There's also a task manager editor, and you might think that adding this to your game mode is already everything you need to make it work, but actually not quite. Because each of these tasks, in order for you to be able to select them in the UI, the task needs to be assigned to your faction. So by default, they're not assigned to any faction. And when you create them, you need to assign them, for example, to US, and then US soldiers can click on and accept that task. But also the base task manager here won't do that for you. So what you might think is you could add a script to it. But don't add a script to it. I don't know why exactly, but every time I tried adding a script to a task manager, it would just crash on me. I'd have to delete the task manager and restart the world editor for it to recover from that. So just don't do that. Also, one thing you cannot do is if you have a task here, don't add a script onto the task, because it's going to change the class of this task. You can see now it says SCR trigger task, right? If we add a script to it, and we'll have to give it a name here for a sec. If we add a script to this, you can see that the class is now move1 class, which is inherited from that SCR trigger task. And because we changed the class here with our script, the task won't be recognized by the task manager. So don't add scripts to tasks or task managers. If you need a custom task manager or task, either the trigger task is enough for you, or you'll have to override it in a proper entity. And that's what we're going to do now. So I'm just going to head to the workbench, and we're going to make sure that we have a scripts, game, entities folder. This needs to exist. And then I'm just going to go into the script editor, and we go to plugins, script wizard. We want to create an entity. I'm going to call it tut for tutorial and task manager. The parent is going to be the SCR base task manager. Under script add-on, make sure it says tutorial project, but keep the $ and the colon. And then you don't want SCR, generate functions, or active flag. We want none of that. And I'm just going to hit OK, and we'll end up with a script like this. And we have our task manager. Now, what we want to do is we want to assign a function to our task. But that means first we need to know what our task is. Now, there's multiple ways we can do this. We already did this in a previous video where we used attribute with an array of strings to have the names to our entities. And then we used find entity to get it. And then we can actually set the task action. That's one way of doing it if you want to do it that way. Another way you could do it is you could, like our game mode here, you could make the tasks a child of the task manager and then just add all the children to it. Or what we can also just do is in the base task manager, there is actually already an array MA task list, which is a list of all the tasks that exist. And if a new task gets created, it's automatically added to this task list. So in case you spawn tasks dynamically at runtime, it will be in this list. And as I just said, spawning them at runtime, this is probably the better idea for tasks anyways, because right now, initialization order, it's very important. The task manager must initialize before the tasks, but I don't think that the order is actually guaranteed. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to make our tasks children of our task manager anyways, even though we don't need to, because children seem to be initialized after the parent. We're going to take a look at how to dynamically spawn tasks in a later video, so we can get that out of the way. But placing them in the editor still works, you just have to be a bit careful. Okay, so we're just going to use this task list, but then we still need to know what faction to assign it to. So if you're making a co-op mission, you can just assign them to whatever faction you want to be, and you could have an attribute for that in here. So you could have probably a string faction key in your task manager, and then it would assign all tasks to that faction. But let's say you want to have like a versus mission and still have tasks on both sides, but you don't want to spawn them dynamically, they should be pre-placed. Well, in that case, we probably do want an attribute to set that. And actually you could either have an array here of like USSR tasks, and you could have another array of US tasks. That's also a possibility. What I want to do is I just want to create a new task. What we're going to do is we're going to come to Script Wizard. I'm going to create an entity, and I'm going to call it tutorial trigger task. And parent is going to be the SCR trigger task. I'm going to hit OK. And now in here, I want to set the attribute of string faction key. And this isn't in the official guidelines, but I'm going to prefix my attributes with A. I'm just going to have them be A underscore and then what it is. So if you also want to have the type prefix, you would do it like this: A underscore S for string and then faction key. So usually we would use M for member because it's a member of a class. I'm going to use A because it's an attribute, but you don't have to do that. It's not actually in the guidelines. I'm going to link the guidelines in the description if you want to have a look at them. They're just in the wiki. Now, this by itself isn't enough to create our own task though. Our task needs two more classes actually. One of them is going to be tutorial trigger task data, which we're going to inherit from SCR trigger task data. And this one's actually going to be empty because we're not doing anything special with replication here. But in the next tutorial, we're going to have a closer look at this one. And we need tutorial trigger task support class, which we're also going to inherit from SCR trigger task support class. Oh, we don't actually need semicolons there. And in this support class, we want to, first we need to give it an attribute, which is, I think, base container props. This is necessary for it to show up in the workbench later. I'm going to show you where we need it. And we also want to override, first of all, the constructor. And in the constructor, we need to set mTypeName equal to our tutorial trigger task. So basically saying this trigger task support class belongs to this trigger task class. And then we also need to override the, it will return SCR base task data. It's called create task data. We want to overwrite that, and it's just going to return a new tutorial trigger task data. Okay, this is it for our task. We're not really going to do much more with it here. Okay, so the error was that the constructor is actually returning void. That's my bad. Forgot that. We hit F7, it should now compile correctly. Yes. Alright, so back to our task manager, and what we want to do here is override Eon init so we can assign factions to the tasks. And I'm first going to call super Eon init, so that's out of the way. And after that, we can create a for each loop where we loop through all our tasks. They are going to be SER based tasks, and they come from the MA task list, which is in the base task manager, the list of all tasks, as we already looked at. Next, we want to grab our trigger task class. I'm just going to copy it because I'm lazy. I'm going to rename this to base task. And we want to try casting this base task. We want to try casting this base task to our tutorial trigger task. And if that worked, we could then set task faction of the task to its faction. Now, we still need to get the faction manager here actually, and we don't want to do that in a for each loop, so let's just do it before. There we go. And the faction is actually going to be faction manager get. Why is this? Okay. If you don't get completion, make sure there's no errors or anything like half finished functions. You want to get faction by key, and the key is in task.get faction key. That's the reason we cast it to our tutorial trigger. And then we can say set task faction of the task to our faction. Now this piece of code here, we can put that in its own function, which is going to become important later because we want to call it from another place as well. This isn't the only place we need to call it from. So I'm going to create an own function, which is going to be set tasks factions. Or let's call it different. Let's say set faction for tasks. That makes more sense. Which is just going to get the faction manager, and then, I mean, you could check if we even have a faction manager, right? But let's just assume we do. It's going to crash if we don't anyways. No, for best practice, you should really check if you have a faction manager. And you can print no faction manager local level error and return. Right. And then we're just going to go through all our tasks that we have, and we're going to set their faction. Easy as that. And now we can just call this here. But there's one more thing to be careful about. Is this set task faction call down here. If we go to that, it says should only be called on the server. And we can see it actually checks that it's a master only method, and it should be, and it does RPC stuff. So we really don't want to call this on every client because Eon init runs everywhere the task manager exists. And because it's going to be in our list in our hierarchy here, it's going to exist on every client, not just the server. So we actually need to make sure we are not the server. We can either do this with the replication component, checking if is master, which is going to tell us if we are the server, basically. Or we can just say is proxy, which is a function in the task manager, which just says replication component is proxy. And proxy is the opposite of master. It's, well, basically a client. So if we're the proxy, we want to return only run on server. Great. So now we're setting the factions for tasks on the server only. And this should be enough to make it work in single player, actually. Well, if you only want single player, you can ignore this as proxy call. But let's give it a try. I'm gonna go here and we're gonna hit Shift R to recompile our scripts. And then we're gonna set them up. Okay, so stuff is recompiled. We're gonna go over to create and we're gonna search for tutorial task manager and we're gonna drag him in. There it is. Tutorial task manager. Now, the way it is right now, it's not gonna function actually. First of all, we need to add some components to it. And the first of them is the replication component. We should set streamable to disabled. I'm not actually quite sure what it does, but I think for the default task manager, this was set to disabled. Or can be streamed in and out of replication as necessary. I guess if we disable it, it's always in replication and can't like disappear if it's too far away or something. So that's probably a useful thing to have. Our task manager should always replicate. We also need this SCR texts task manager component. Well, I'm not actually sure if we need it. It's necessary if you want Game Master to place this kind of a task. Basically in these are like the predetermined texts. You know, they're gonna be like move to and then gonna have some attribute here like the town name or something. If you've played the Game Master before, you've seen this. We're just gonna add it and we're not really gonna bother with it. You can probably copy it from the task manager editor, which has this set up with like a bunch of 21 tasks or something. Maybe you can copy the component. All right, and the third component that we need is also called task, I think it's called task UI. It's UI task manager component, that way around. This is gonna make it so our task can show up in the UI when we press J. All right, so we got that. We're not quite done yet. We need one more thing, and that's in the task manager itself. We're gonna come down to supported task types. We're gonna add our we call it tutorial trigger task support class. And this is where the support class is needed. And that's why in our support class, remember we needed to put this base container props. If you forgot that, it's not gonna show up in this list. That's what we need it for. All right, so this is enough. Now, if you also want to support the SCR trigger task and maybe the evacuate task or something, you need to just add them here. You can just say editor task, I want that, etc. Add them here. I don't think you need to give them a prefab. I'm not quite sure what the prefab would be used for. Maybe if the game master places them down, but I'm not sure. So we just add this task here and now that's supported. I'm just gonna save. And that should be it for our task manager. I'm gonna remove this other task manager here. You can't have two task managers, they're gonna interfere with one another. And now it would be kind of useful to create a prefab of that because we don't want to set up all these components every time. What we'll do is we'll come to our resource browser, tutorial project, and we can create a prefab folder. You can just right click new folder, for example, and then you can come over to the hierarchy, click your tutorial task manager and just drag it in here. And you give it a name. And there you are. It's now a prefab that you can just drag in like that. Nice. Next up, we want to grab our tutorial trigger task. We drag that in, you can see again, it's not a prefab, it's just the entity itself, and it's not gonna have any trigger or stuff assigned to it. So you can come over here and you can set the task name and description. Right? And do whatever you like here. Next, we're also going to come over here again to create, and we're going to create a SCR base faction trigger, for example. You can create any trigger you like, really, because we're making this trigger task. And it's going to be a child of our trigger task. Now, by the way, you don't want to add a replication component to your task, because the task manager takes care of replicating the tasks for you. So don't add a replication component here. But one thing we do want to add here as a component is an SCR map descriptor component. Pay attention, there's also a map descriptor component, but that doesn't work. You have to grab the SCR version of it. And then in here you can also have like a display name or something. This is just going to make it show up on the map, and we're going to not select tree. We're going to have it show up as task. And I'm just going to move this a bit out here so it's not going to overlap with our spawn point too much on the map. All right. And that's just going to cause it to show up on the in-game map. Right. And then we can come to our trigger entity. Oh, right. Also, you could just grab a trigger from a prefab, of course. Right, so this is the base trigger task, and let's check what does the trigger need inside the trigger task. It needs hierarchy component because it's supposed to be a child of our trigger. So we need to actually add hierarchy here, else the trigger task won't be able to find it as a child. That's necessary. And we don't actually need the trigger area mesh. That's this white ring around it. We don't need to have that. So let's just get rid of this again. And we have our hierarchy, and everything is done. Now I want this to be a move task, so I'm just going to put faction key US here. This is going to be a sphere. I'm going to draw a shape so we can see where it is, though I'm going to make it transparent. I'm going to make it a bit bigger. And there's our move trigger. I'm also going to enable periodic queries, so it's going to actually check if a player walks into it. And we're going to activate on first change. The first time player walks into this with faction key US, it's going to activate, and that's going to finish our task. Now on class filter, you can, by default, the base trigger task does this. You can filter by chimera character if you want, or you don't have to. It's going to save, and there we are. And now we also want to create a prefab of our new trigger task. So I'm going to come down to tutorial project prefabs, and I'm going to drag it in here. I'm going to create it. Cool. So now all of this is saved. And there's one more thing I want to do, which is I'm going to take the task and I'm going to put it inside the task manager as a child. This just ensures that the task is initialized after the task manager, which is absolutely necessary. Else it's not going to actually work. One last thing before we actually go in game. We have to come to our trigger task, and under unsorted at the bottom, we actually have to give it a faction key for US. Else it's not going to show up. Alright, there we are. Spawned in, and if I press J, there is our tutorial task. Please listen carefully. And I can accept it. And we should get a message because we ticked assign message. Now, if I unassign it, we shouldn't. Oh, we do. Well, that's cool. Notify assign unassigned isn't ticked, but maybe that's something else. I thought it's the message. Anyways, we have a message. And if we go in here, we get that it's been completed because our trigger did on activate, which automatically completes the task and removes it from the map. And if we go on the map, yeah, it's completely gone. So also if you look on the map, you'll see like a big red square here that indicates your task. That's the map descriptor component from the task. Okay, so the next thing to do is to try this out in multiplayer. But how are you gonna try it out in multiplayer? You have to go host a server, get a friend, and give it a try? No, actually there's something built in here to basically start the game up twice and connect to yourself. Alright, here we are. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna come up here to plugins, settings, peer tool. And the first thing you want to do is you want to come over here where it says game.exe, and you want to give that a path to the Reforger exe. So what you can do that is go to Steam, go to settings, and you can go to find local or search local files, something like that. We're just going to open up Arma Reforger folder, and here you have Arma Reforger Steam. What we're going to do is you can click over here in this bar, just click on a white bit, don't click on a highlighted bit, and it's going to give you a path. You can copy that, just paste it in here, and you want to type a backslash, and we'll go back here again to make sure we don't type wrong. You can click on the exe file, you can F2, Control C to copy, paste it in here, .exe. And you're done. Next thing you want to do is under peers Windows, you want to click plus to generate one peer config. And in my case, I want to come down to max FPS and reduce that. And oh, by the way, don't hit enter when you're in here, because you're actually going to create a second one by accident. And one more thing I want to do is, because my Arma Reforger projects aren't in Arma Reforger add-ons, but instead in Arma Reforger projects, I need to also copy this path. And I'm going to come to params, and I'm going to type dash add-ons dir, and then in quotes I'm going to paste this path. Make sure you put quotes around it because there's spaces in the path, else it's not going to work. I'm going to hit OK, and now we come to this little drop down next to the play triangle, and we're going to go to server localhost plus peer tool. Make sure you're saved and make sure your code is compiled. So if you ever get an error when starting the peer tool that says that it failed to start up, just close out and make sure that you hit Shift R to compile the latest version of your scripts, and then you can hit play. Actually, I got an error. So this is what I meant. If you get an error like this, you need to make sure you actually saved and recompiled. So let's just exit out here. Make sure we save and then just recompile the scripts as well. Okay, so if you saved and recompiled and you still get this error, and you can't close it, one thing you can do is just restart Workbench entirely. Sometimes that helps. Okay, so in this case, reloading Workbench was needed for it to work, and don't worry about the invisible stuff. My PC is kind of slow. And but you'll see that if we press J, it's not in the objectives, but over here it is. But this other guy or other person, it doesn't see them. He can even see the task here on the map. You can see the big red triangle says task, but he can't accept it. For him it doesn't exist, so this is the next issue that we need to fix. And it's actually the last issue we need to fix. And then we're pretty much done with this tutorial. And in a few days' time I will show you how to add custom data to your tasks as well. So to be completely honest, I'm not entirely sure why we have to do this. I was talking to a dev, and basically what he told me is it should work the way it is now. And what we're about to do seems kind of like a hack, like it shouldn't be necessary. But all I can tell you is when we do it, stuff starts working. So let's just go ahead and do that. And there is a method that we're going to override, which is called onPlayerRegistered. Basically, this happens every time a player joins the game. Even if it's a join in progress. So after the mission started, so it's not just for like the initial players. Every time someone joins the game, this function gets called, and apparently gets called for everyone. Every single player gets this function call. And even a player who are already registered apparently get called again, but I'm not too sure about that. Anyways, first thing we want to do is, of course, the super call. You never want to forget that. And then what we're just going to do here is we're going to set the tasks faction again, so that the player who just joined, who didn't have this faction set for him yet, can also have it set. But again, we need to make sure that we are actually on the server. Is proxy. Then we want to return. Else we're going to call set faction for tasks. And this is just going to call, well, our function again, which is for every task, it's going to set the faction correctly. And so when a new player joins, this function is called for that. You're telling us, hey, this player just joined the game. And then we have to set the factions again, so that this set task faction calls its RPC and sets the task faction on that player's computer. And then that player can see it in his UI. Okay. Let's first get rid of that warning by just calling it registered player ID. And I think I had a typo there in player ID as well, which is this error. Okay, there you go. So now we can go back here, Shift R. Alright, so this reloaded, and we'll just make sure we have Pure Tool selected, and let's go try it out. Firstly, in our normal player here, everything is as always. We can assign the task to us, we can show it on the map, etc. Nothing should have changed here at all. Okay, and here we go. Our other player joined the game, and if we hit J, there we go. Tutorial task, please listen carefully, and even the assigned player, it's all there now. We can accept it, and for the other player, you can see he also sees that it's been accepted. And let's go try walking into it. It's somewhere over here. Hope I made it big enough. I think I ran past it. Okay, so it's gonna be over here. There we go. I just barely ran past it. Okay. So you can see now its objective has been completed. It's gone here as well. So that's your basic task system for Arma. And again, I'm going to leave my notes on how you can do all this in the description. And I also encourage you to check out AR Night Ops. They're doing some more stuff like unlocking a new task once the old one is completed, but I'm sure you can figure that out by yourself. If you want me to make a tutorial about that, just leave it in the comments. And I will. And then next up, we're going to take a look at actually adding some more custom data to our tasks. Like, for example, making a eliminate this target task. And yeah, that's going to be coming up soon. And I'll see you then. Goodbye.